Exceptional Randos show is produced live in Sunroom Studios' Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.
Well, that was random. Exceptional Radio.
Good afternoon. It's the 6th of September, and we've got some things for you. There's a new Ridley Scott television series called Raised by Wolves, and I encourage everyone to go take a look at it. It's fascinating and beautiful. It looks like a Ridley Scott movie, and they've just chopped it up into 40-minute segments. So prepare for, good gravy, how long is that? Like 6 hours? 6 hours? No, not 6 hours. It's like 5 hours worth of movie, basically. They're only halfway through, though, so there's plenty of time to get caught up. And we're going to talk about, the Matrix and its variations. And, oh yeah, there was a boat rally in Texas where a bunch of boats sank. But I'm not really going to focus on that. It's a beautiful day today. It's nice and kind of overcast, so everything is a little diffuse, but colors are just fantastic. So if you're going to go out and photograph things, now's the time.
It's crazy how quick fall's getting here.
Oh, it's beautiful. Green looks extra green. It's not so bright out that it just, my big complaint about summer isn't so much that it's hot or humid or insects or any of that stuff. It's that the UV index gets so intense that I can't go outside without sunglasses. I can't look at things without having to filter it. And so, I love sunglasses because they protect my eyes, but there's something to be said for removing that interference from your eyes and being able to see what's actually in front of you.
Yeah, it's really crazy. I'm always interested to see the different spectrums that other animals are able to see, like when they present UV, what it would look like if we were able to see with UV. Like, it's crazy how much we can see, but we still can't, and how much is still limited by our perception and our biology.
Well, don't insects, I believe insects and animals or creatures in general that can see UV spectrum, they have like a fourth rod or something like that, or a fourth cone.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
I remember a few years ago, there was this really, there are actually several pieces about it through various scientific journals and reporting agencies about people who had extended color spectrum visibility or range. Like, there were people who could perceive deeper gradients of red almost into the near infrared spectrum, and there were people who were able to perceive electromagnetic spectrum into the larger UV wavelengths. And it was actually a really interesting concept to me as a photographer, because it challenged me to look for red in places that it didn't exist. And so I started to notice it in the leaves of trees when they were still green, and I started to notice like more subtle variations of red in places that I just never would have expected them.
Yeah, there was a study on cultural influence on color, and there's like some culture that can see multiple, where we only see 2 different shades of blue, they can see like 40, but then they can't see like, I think it's reds or browns or something really well. And so it's really crazy how much your language and your local geographic and ecological habitation affect your capacity to perceive color, and it's like scientifically proven.
Well, that makes sense. The Earth, our atmosphere is essentially a giant lens. And that's why we see, rainbows on when it's raining somewhere between us and the sun because it creates that prismatic effect. But the entire atmosphere itself functions as a lens in the sense that if you're on the far side, light has to travel further, and so colors like red are more prominent. But if you're closer, then that doesn't happen as much. So you get more greens and blues and yellows and like shadow information not from red.
Think about the ecosystem and how it's for those who live within it, including humans. But I just think of, say, humans aren't there, or there's no footprint from human industrialization, then there doesn't seem to be any external interference in the perceptual modalities of the animals living within the ecosystem that fulfill the roles of predator, prey, food chain hierarchy within the natural setting. And once industrialization or pollution is introduced, it's not just a matter of, oh, this is unhealthy biologically from the standpoint of inhaling or ingesting the byproducts of these industrial processes with various synthetic chemicals or man-made objects that enter the groundwater or the atmosphere in general. But I think maybe one of the first effects on the ecosystem is perhaps an animal's ability to perceive the spectrum, or to be able to use the fullness of its innate perceptual organs and senses with the presence of these molecules that are interfering with it. So, a dumbing down of the sense of smell, or an obscuring of the spectrum of vision based off of various perhaps radiation generated from the industrial setting, or heat patterns that mess with the animal's ability to hunt in the dark or even during the daytime, or if there's an electromagnetic disturbance that's emanating from a structure, then it makes it difficult to navigate. And that can throw off not just local ecosystems, but global ecosystems.
Yeah, and I think that the global aspect is where when people assume that everybody sees the same blue when we're all looking at the sky, it's a mistake. It's one of these, like when I made that comment earlier, I messed up the colors, but the point was the same. It's in that the whole premise was like people were postulating that at one point humans might not have been able to see the color blue because of the way in some texts, like the ocean is described as being the color of wine, or in the case of the Himba tribe in Namibia, they can't really distinguish between blue and green that much, but they can see other details and find details much better than the average human. And they can distinguish between other colors much better. And then there was other geographically isolated people that had many more names for blue than like Americans do in terms of how they define different gradients. So that's where I had mixed up the colors, but again, the premise was the same in that when people again, for a while, I think humans would make the mistake of assuming like if two people are looking at the same sky, they're both seeing the same blue, and that level of assumption is one where that predisposition to not empathize with others and also be able to fathom that your perception is not the only perception that exists. It's also something that I think limits Western capacity to engage with other non-Western approaches to existence.
I think that works out right up into the point that we understand that physiologically, not everyone's eye is composed of the same number of rods and cones, and that our retinas are not they're not carbon copies of one another. And also, you know, brown doesn't exist on the electromagnetic spectrum. There's no color brown. It's actually like the amalgam of a group of oranges and reds and yellows and just everything that our brains can't process accurately. It's not to say that brown isn't a color. It just doesn't exist where we think it does or the way that we think it does. Our brain has to synthesize it. It's the same thing with pink. Pink is a variation of red. So, there are a lot of things, and of course they're kind of obfuscated by color theory within art.
Brown does this like.
Wait, sorry, what was that?
I was gonna say, when you say like brown doesn't exist on the color spectrum, I wonder if brown people have some weird appearance that babies can see that then we end up training out of our vision because it just looks too weird. Because I know like a lot of times kids have the weirdest reaction to me. They're either like horrified, like terrified to the point they can't look at me, or they're like just, what's the word? Not even, it's beyond fascinated. They are in awe of like, I don't know what it is, but it's either or. So that's where I'm looking at it. Like, I wonder again if there's just something about a certain like type of brown that interacts with light in a way that we train out of our psyche, just so we don't have to like deal with the craziness of like what that would look like.
Well, it makes me wonder what an aura really is. Does that mean that in some portion of the spectrum beyond what we consider visible light, our skin reflects some kind of luminescence or radiance? Like, what if the reason that brown is so complex is that it actually has like a golden reflection, or the reason that pale skin tones, maybe they have like a silvery reflection or aura or radiance? What if people with a lot of melanin, they have their own radiance, like a red cast? There's so much. The visible portion of the electromagnetic spectrum is so tiny that to believe that that's all that's there is just, that's just a lack of awareness of how electromagnetism works.
For sure. And that's again where that when you're talking about that radiance and then people talking about auras in the sense of there's a mysticized pseudoscience element to it, but then there is this element of everything radiates. There's going to be entropic radiation from a person's skin, just pure physics. That's going to happen. So what does that look like? What does that have any correlation to anything is the question. And where some people will automatically assert, well, not automatically, out the gate assert that there is some sort of relation to this aura and like your emotions or how you're feeling or what you're doing or whatever. Maybe, but that until we actually are able to scientifically analyze it, we can't make that assumption. But then we also can't ignore that radiation happens. That's just what happens with bodies.
Well,
period.
We're reflecting everything that the sun is pumping at us that's not being filtered by our atmosphere.
Yep.
And maybe variations of melanin and skin type have different reflectance properties.
I mean, even then, we're conducting our own energy. like we are like the whole reason we have body heat is because we are creating or we are processing energy to the point of then having a byproduct of radiation. It'll be low level radiation, like very low level, but we're going to radiate something because we are generating heat.
Yeah. And that's not to say that all radiation is ionizing radiation that causes disintegration of organic tissue or anything like the decomposition.
Yeah, like science fiction and poorly written media has made the term radiation seem as if it's like always toxic.
I think
Or,
radiant is a way to describe somebody who looks extra good.
yeah, for sure.
So
Yeah, it's like a sign of health to
yeah,
be radiant. Yeah.
Or when people are pregnant, they'll say they're glowing. Like,
Exactly.
I don't think that that's a coincidence.
pregnancy
I think-
radiation.
So this really brings up a great point to consider the divergence of thought and perception in regards to the concept of the aura and radiation from biological beings and how that energy can be perceived and what modalities are used to perceive them by different types of biological beings. Because, you know, from certain spiritual perspectives, there's the concept of an aura that is a combination of like thought, speech, action. It's kind of like a reflection of how people interact with the other people in their environments or the other living beings in their environments, and then there's supposed to be some sort of, you know, spiritual reflection back. It's kind of like an extension of the whole concept of checks and balances that's very common in a lot of religions that rely on that kind of principle. But then there's also the biophysiological aspect of radiation from human beings or from animals even, that allows perhaps certain elements of health or certain elements of physiological processes or stages to be perceived. Because it makes me think about the cats and the therapy animals, essentially, that are often spoken about in hospice settings. You know, there's a lot of these stories about, oh, the cat that goes to the room of the person who's going to pass away next in a hospice, and how do they know? Is it something that they can smell? Is biological decay part of it, or is it something they can see? I mean, we can't really interview a cat at this point and say what is the reason for you going to this person's room next, or why do you cuddle with them a particular way or curl up at their feet? And then, you know, dogs also have a certain sense of what's going on in a particular environment, and they also tend to absorb any kind of stressful situation and start to act on those types of feelings and maybe even project them later in their lives, which can make it more difficult for them to be trained or for them to be integrated into certain kind of dynamics. So when we're talking about auras, you know, I think we're talking about a lot of different things. We're talking about a lot of different factors. It's a very broad concept that can be filtered into a lot of different perspectives. So we were talking about people being able to or not being able to. I don't want to even say someone's not able to perceive something, because their perception is their perception. You know, somebody who's born with the term with the medical term color blindness, right? They're able to actually perceive color just differently, because there are those enchroma glasses that allow them to perceive what I believe to them is, you know, the brilliance of radiation, just in a different way. It's they're you know, it could be considered a form of assistance, or it could be considered, you know, just a natural expression of how they're able to perceive radiation from the environment. And then if they can see those things, you know, or if they can perceive those things during an interaction with another human being, does that ultimately change their perception of interpersonal contact and subsequently their perception of what could be an aura. So there are a whole lot of different ways to look at auras and radiation and radiance through different lenses.
Yeah, I think in 2009, even as far back, they they confirmed that humans do actually glow, and they do actually emit light. Um, it's let's see.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
2009, the human body literally glows, emitting invisible light in extremely small quantities at levels that rise and fall with the day, scientists now reveal. This is, I'll post a link, but it's in Live Science.
yeah, because I don't remember. They didn't really go too much further into those studies after that discovery. Um, but yeah, I think also the eyes might like be able to emit a single photon or something. Let me, because there's a few things that did not sound like they would be correct that then were confirmed. Um,
National Geographic did a study, or did a reporting on it. This is actually kind of cool.
yeah, because human eye can detect a single photon. But yeah, I'd have to do more research because it's like if
The human body's bioluminescence is 1,000 times less intense than the sensitivity of the human eye, but perhaps in the distant future, we'll get to a point where we can see that stuff. I wonder if there are people who have like really like extra sensitive eyes, and so they're to be able to see everything. Their brains kind of detune everything. But if you were to put them in like near absolute darkness, they would actually be able to see better than a normal person. Maybe they're like the bioluminescence would only be 100 times less intense for a person who has what are commonly regarded as like color deficiencies. But it really maybe it's an adaptation for darker climates where there just isn't as much light.
yeah, I don't know, but I found an article that referenced it. There is proof of ultra weak photon emission from rat eyes.
Oh
Um,
wow.
yeah, so I wasn't just making this up. There is a such thing as the detection of photon emission, random photon emission from an eye, because they don't know why it came through, because it could have just been passing through like the animal randomly through that trajectory, and that's where
Yeah.
they don't know what is causing it. So at this time, it's like classified as a random emission. Um, but that's again, we have photons randomly emitting through eyes, like, and then we also have proof that humans do glow. So there's all these things about what pseudoscience was calling auras and things like that that now have some sort of scientific, I won't call it proof, there's some sort of scientific validation of the concept, because they don't seem to have any real connection to anything yet. And that if we can then look at somebody's aura and start to analyze like what it looks like, the emissions look like based on whether it be emotions or thoughts or even actions, then those things would have to be correlated to a high level to actually mean something. Otherwise, it's just random noise, and that's kind of where it's not to say that it's not possible to find some sort of correlation, but we're so far from that. And then the way that, when people are like, "Oh, your astrological sign," it's so crazy how much people will let themselves believe pseudoscience to then get feel as if they have some semblance of control over their lives, knowing damn well that like at the core these things are just bullshit and they're just lying to themselves. Like I don't know, man. If it's good to have superstitions and good luck charms and all that, but when people start to conflate them with science, that shit starts to get real dangerous.
Yeah, you know, Western science is finding the proof practically every day for a lot of you know Eastern medicine. They're discovering that those weird roots or mushrooms or lichen that's scraped off of a piece of the side of a mountain at a specific altitude has properties that are beneficial to human physiology, and so it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of mysticism or spirituality was eventually backed by science, like at all. I feel like there's a very good reason to devote those kinds of minds to that field to that kind of study, because if 1,000 people all agree that they're seeing something, maybe there's something there. If 10,000 people, 1,000,000 people, if they all agree that there's something there, we shouldn't just be like, oh, there's nothing there. That's just shitty. That's how you
Yeah,
alienate people.
I mean, but at the same time, if then like you have a bunch of people who are then given a story and an expectation, and they all have the same expectation, how do you separate that? Once something's in the wild, it's
Yeah.
very difficult.
Well, peer review and multiple studies, and there's a way. There's got to be
Right. I mean, again, they did a study on out of body experiences where they would put something on the top shelf of emergency rooms, and then if somebody reported they had an out of body experience, they would ask them to report what they saw on the top shelf, and sometimes they had it. Like sometimes the people would actually report it correctly. So there are ways to test these types of things. So it's not like but it wasn't a significant enough amount to be, you know, it was within the margin of randomness that the people got it right. It's
a way.
like just because one person randomly got it right doesn't mean it's actually a thing.
Yeah. So maybe
Like
the threshold needs to be really high, like
that's it
100,000 people.
is. I mean, that's the whole point of statistical significance is like,
Yeah.
you can determine if you have a number of cases and a number of results, then how many of those results would need to prove or be valid to prove the concept and be statistically significant? And that's the whole like when something happens, that doesn't mean it's statistically significant. It could be the one random exception, and that's kind of where when people see some shit happen, it's like they don't necessarily think about the potential for that being the random statistically uh, anomalous instance of something where it's like within that margin of error of being just random noise.
Kind of like seeing a religious figure in some burnt toast.
Exactly. I mean, even then, that's like pareidolia in that humans are primed to see patterns in things. So that's why you see like patterns in clouds or faces and things that don't necessarily, like if you look at a light or an electrical outlet, it's going to look like a face because our brains are primed to look for threats in the wild and spot them immediately. So if you see a lion or a tiger in the bush, you'll see that face before it has a chance to pounce on you. So we are primed to find symmetry in faces before they find us. So there's all these things working against humans in terms of our perception and how we are able to navigate uh, the real world, in that our brain's constantly trying to protect us from threats. Sometimes we're just walking down the street and then you see some, like, a face in something, and you're either amused or scared, or you're like, oh, is this a ghost, or is this something I should take a picture of to post on Instagram because it's a dinosaur cloud? And then it's like there's all these elements of, well, other people see it. You want confirmation that other people also see it, and then that it's like we reinforce our confirmation bias by then picking out the things that align with what we're hoping instead of what's the actual science. And that kind of becomes the problem when, like, okay, then there's like the gambler's fallacy. And when you're doing something, it's actually as if you're doing it for the first time. So every time you take a flight, your chances of getting into a crash are effectively equally the same, because there's a ton of flights happening, whereas the predisposition is to just be like, oh, this is my first flight. It's 1 out of 100,000 or 1 out of a million, when it's like, no, it's out of the total number of flights. So because the flights are happening constantly, every time you take a flight, it's like resetting that chance, which is a good thing. So that's kind of where, like, the more flights you take over your life, you would think that it would actually increase your chances of taking or having a crash, but you would actually have to go into the, like, probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of flights for that to actually be true, because every single time is so many flights are happening between your next flight that the chances are not actually increasing the number of flights you take, unless you're like constantly taking new flights.
So not to derail statistical significance, which I believe is actually quite significant, and this is going to sound like product placement, but it's not, because this is a Kickstarter campaign that ended back in 2016. There's a company called Toasteroid that makes a smart toaster which can print images into your toast, like burn images into toast. $89 or $79. It's over. I mean, I don't think you can get one of these anymore, but I just wanted to point that out.
Exceptional Randos toast.
Yeah, you can get some rando toast.
Put it in like lucite or something. Turn it into a keychain. Well, lucite toast keychain.
You can print Iron Man on your toast, or Batman, or anyone. You can print anything on it. It's no longer just a freak occurrence of an old toaster that happens to burn the effigy of a religious figure.
I think going back to what Chris was saying, the human desire to associate noise with significance is a documented occurrence that is supported by theory, fact, and peer review, that has existed in the wild and has been available to just about anybody for a particularly long time. And it seems like there's no shortage of people who just refuse to encounter, because I mean, I feel like, this information is basically on the spectrum of the human perceptual billboard. I mean, it should just be there. And there are people who simply refuse to encounter that kind of an idea or synthesize it into their daily routine of encountering information in the wild themselves. And then on another note, I mean, manufacturing imagery that could be considered significant, and then manufacturing imagery versus randomly, quote unquote, randomly occurring imagery. is a little bit different, but it doesn't have to be marketed as such. And I think a lot, what we've talked about in the past about the desire to see extraterrestrial interference or communication or what's the word? Intervention in particular events in history where it may not actually be the case or probably isn't the case, could also be associated with the human predisposition to look for essentially faces on electrical outlets or faces in the bush in the wild, or to see things in clouds. Then somebody writes it down and shares it with a bunch of people and says, this noise is significant. Clearly this means something. It's a message. And clearly this message is beyond us, or it's something that, based off of what I know right now, which is technically, quote unquote, what I know. So I'm speaking from this other person's perspective. And again, also from my perspective, because my knowledge is limited. But if somebody in their limited knowledge makes an assumption that turns into an assertion, that they then turn themselves from a theory into a fact, because a lot of people are willing to be essentially afraid of the same thing all at the same time, that I think that's where we get a lot of this confirmation bias.
And then that is actually a condition called apophenia, where there's a tendency to mistakenly perceive connections and meaning between unrelated things. And this is where you have the people who are posting these like 30-page diatribes where it's like, Bill Clinton was on a plane, Tom Hanks was on a plane, Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself. What about that? What about those facts? And you're like, wait, what? What does that have? What do those three things have to do with anything with each other? And it's like,
isn't that magical thinking?
Oh man.
Yeah, there's a lot of magical thinking that, going back millennia, I think people have always had a tendency to engage in magical thinking. And because I don't know who the empiricists of the millennia ago were. When you think about the people who may or may not have encountered angelic beings, or relying solely on biblical recordings as not refusing to acknowledge the fact that it could be in large part allegorical as opposed to factual, or not necessarily, or essentially conflating the allegory with fact, and not differentiating between what could be present in certain texts or certain writings as, this is supported by what we know of the archaeological record, versus this is what we don't know, and what kind of assumptions are being made based off of that information. So I think about like the Tower of Babel, like if I'm thinking about that as something that actually existed, and it exists within the allegorical biblical reference, or if somebody takes it literally, then there are timelines that exist that have been verified by biblical scholars. And not all biblical scholars are prone to magical thinking. There's also a lot of peer review in that perspective, and retractions and theories and things like that, and people who are trusted more than others, and theories and ideas that are presented more predominant than others across all religious communities. I think that's where you have the concept of the elder, somebody who's spent the most time thinking about it. But even at that, just because somebody spends a lot of time thinking about something doesn't mean they're the most qualified to make assumptions and assertions. And that's where it gets back to the concept of empiricism. And it's also why I'm thinking about, the Tower of Babel, because if I'm just thinking about it as a structure, that was supposed to be a feat of engineering. And when it's analyzed as an event, it's essentially within the continuum that we exist in. If we look at it through that lens, then it was a technological feat that of engineering, of science, of chemistry, of physics. And in order to reach those types of levels, there had to be a certain element or presence of empirical development, or empiricism as applied to the development of technology leading up to that. So I think about these hints that we see of, how did empiricism present itself in the times, that predate history, or recorded history, or things like that. And then also the concept of the idea of recorded history, and what can we rely upon, what recordings can we rely upon, and what interpretations can we rely upon.
Yeah, because then, you have the Epic of Gilgamesh, and then you have other Sumerian texts, and then you have the I Ching, and you have these other things that are pointing to empiricism thousands of years ago. But because empiricism in those contexts does not then benefit Western superiority, I think that they're not as taught in the West. And that's why, especially like even King David, for example, a lot of stuff about King David would represent empiricism like multiple thousands of years ago. But in that context, it's still even abstracted to make it seem as if there's some sort of mysticism that usurps the empiricism. And I think that's kind of where the construction of science as emerging from the West is only dependent upon erasing empiricist evolution from other contexts in the Western context.
Absolutely. And what you said makes me think about how if in matters of faith, empiricism is not allowed to exist, then that's all people have, is other people telling them what to believe instead of trying to figure it out for themselves. And basically being in a position to not accept the fact that spiritual occurrences or spirituality can coexist with empiricism. And it doesn't have to be just a tool, essentially, to influence people's patterns of behavior. It can actually be a way to, I don't want to even say enlighten, but I think it can just be a way to combine multiple philosophies in a non-detrimental way, as long as the person is willing to acknowledge that the empirical can also exist alongside the spiritual. But then it's also a matter of how is the spiritual influencing the path of the empirical development, in which case is it truly empirical? And then likewise, how can empiricism be applied to the faith-based matter? I think it can be. I think that there can be a lot of empirical practice applied to matters of spirituality. The inherent subjectivity and broad application of just about everything that's recorded on a spiritual level, because it's so difficult to discern, I think in and of itself that generates or should generate a thirst for knowledge. It should generate a desire to, if somebody wishes to be closer to matters of spirituality, they should, seek to understand everything that their ideas of what, is imbued with spirituality, which should technically be all of reality. And what's frustrating to me is that I see so many people not acknowledging the opportunity to approach things from an empirical standpoint. And instead, they simply follow things based solely on very literalist or convenient application of a very limited range of principles that seem to be almost taken out of context. And the context ends up being defined over time by other people for matters of their own convenience. And I think one of the matters of convenience that we're examining right now is the Western utilization of faith in order to promote a particular way of life and to sustain what seems to be, upon empirical examination, something that is unsustainable.
Yeah, I think everything you said is spot on, and there's like, man, you made me think about a lot of different things, and I don't even know necessarily where to start, but obviously Christianity is meant to create a culture that is a hierarchy, top down, also reinforcing the divinity of the king, and by proxy reinforcing the king's control over the nation. So there are definitely aspects of this type of religious text, specifically the Bible, that are meant to reinforce a paradigm of patriarchal top-down hierarchies that then enable people to piecemeal pick and choose how they then live on a local level, because there's like a global representation and then there's the local freedom for interpretation. So that's how you get these people who then have such a bastardized interpretation of these religious texts that they turn around and try to justify all kinds of crazy shit using the same, like all these different people are effectively using the same text to justify a litany of insane shit. Everything from Nazi Germany to Nazi America. I mean, I guess those are two of the same types of things, but it's a wide range of Nazism that gets represented in from the same book, effectively. And this is where, obviously Hitler was not limited to just the Bible, but a lot of his racist and utilitarian constructions are directly lifted from biblical imperialism, or the application of biblical imperialism. Because what I'm starting to realize is, we've discussed the Council of Nicaea on here before, and how the books that were removed then leave a sheepish God figure that teaches the oppressed to turn the other cheek and not fight back, except in random stories. So there's like the element of what got left behind was obviously meant to create a certain type of culture. But then in the context of 2020, knowing how these people have been trained to distance themselves from any book learning that is not reinforcing their cultish behavior, that then those people have been manipulated into thinking armed rebellion in the name of the country has anything to do with their religious texts. This to me gets to the point as to why it's necessary and useful to examine these texts, but also to learn what the actual texts are saying in their um, unbroken versions, to then understand why the Bible needed to have these texts removed so you can then turn around and manipulate people. Like, what was so important that they needed to take it out so that they could then turn around and manipulate people? And that to me is why there is a lot of interesting history that obviously no one could ever truly confirm. But the more you learn about what was rewritten, the better idea it gives you about what was likely the logic driving it and how we got to where we are today, to give you a better chance to get out of it.
Speaking of litany of insane shit, the acronym for litany of insane shit is LOIS. I, I think it's unintentional that this acronym applies so magnificently to the Superman story universe. Lois is literally a litany of insane shit in that world, and Superman's a Moses adaptation, right?
Yeah, for sure, 100%.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go off on that kind of tangent, but it occurred to me when you said that actually applies to a lot of things, not just the club of religion. Although it seems like a lot of things are all the result of horrible interpretations of religious doctrine. So maybe it is all related.
Well, yeah, because then, oh, I'm sorry, Daniel. I didn't mean to cut you off. But
Yeah, no religion is immune to the effects of human intervention through its interpretation in the physical world. There are people who, across all faiths, end up getting extorted, exploited, conned. And sometimes the people perpetrating these acts are identified and punished by the legal systems in place. And other times they end up thriving. And I think it depends on the host culture that the exploitation is occurring in that ends up leading to essentially the destiny of the perpetrator. And it's unfortunate because those destinies are so varied, but at the same time, it allows for an empirical examination because of the diversity of outcome.
yeah, I think that's definitely in line. But again, there's this element of, because we are so far down the historical line and we know how certain things turned out, it becomes this weird race to try to deconstruct historical failures, to then try to not let them play out in real time, because then it's like, obviously there's a lot of information warfare going on, but then because of how the information warfare has been fought, you can't necessarily attack the same subjects or ideologies and expect not to get the same results. So this is where we become bound by our right wing's inability to learn outside of that paradigm, but then to then fight it from outside of that paradigm without supporting what they perceive to be as an attack on their religious beliefs.
Well, that's where we get the reliance of on symbolism by those people. Essentially, they're so incredibly reliant on people, other people or human beings who embody the idea that they're trying to push for their own purposes. And these people become symbols, or they act as symbols. That's why some actors are more successful than others, not just because of their agents, but because they're more adept at portraying the symbols that are written into the script, because they have a particular look. It's the same way we evaluate our politicians. They have a particular look, they speak a certain way, they come from a certain place, the story is right. It all becomes a narrative defined by human intervention. And as you said, Chris, we're so far down, or we're far down enough, because I don't think we're finished just yet, but we're far down enough in the historical line, or we're at the point where we can easily identify through empirical analysis the historical failures, because empirically they have been failures, because we're clearly not at the, we're no closer really to the state of nirvana or the time of peace for all human beings on the planet. I mean, that just doesn't seem to be the case. And who knows? You know, there are some people who are symbols of particular movements saying that when things are at their most chaotic, that is the time when, you know, we're supposed to, you know, see some great revelation. But we've had doomsayers for millennia, and I don't think that's anything new. And it seems to be just as an effective tool or vehicle for manipulating people to essentially support one person's agenda. And again, those people are very adept at utilizing symbols. So the religious figures become symbols. You know, somebody seems to be indoctrinated to the point where on a social media site, if somebody posts a picture of their religious figure in conjunction with a political statement, they feel bad for not acknowledging it in a positive manner or saying something to support it from the comfort of their living room, because that's how they're making a change in the world, because they identify with that symbol. And then that symbol is subsequently tied through information warfare to the ideals of a particular political figure. And all that person needs to do with the support, with the monetary support that either they bring themselves or is gathered by other people who are essentially utilizing that individual's image as a symbol. It's like a symbol of a symbol, really, and it just gets so diluted. But all they really need to do is be just like that thing that somebody sees on social media and say the same thing. And then that person basically devalues their influence within the political process by, and I know we're talking, I'm about to talk about voting, so there's a caveat there. I'm not saying that somebody should or shouldn't do it, but I'm just gonna bring it up. Basically, voting has been almost devalued to the point of liking a social media post or disliking a social media post. There doesn't seem to be any higher level analysis required or involved. And I think that's a reflection of the climate in the West, at least.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the climate in the West, but that's also it's gang warfare now. I mean, I don't know if it ever wasn't, but it's definitely blue versus red gang warfare. Which is funny to me that like nobody thinks of the gangs of New York gangs when we talk about gangs, even though they're basically the originals. And then how black people have then become associated with gangs, even though we didn't start that shit. Yet I digress. The gang warfare that's going on within the voting booth is like it's really blood feud esque as far as I can tell, because nobody seems to actually care about policy, and the right wing is so internally inconsistent concerning their morals and ethics as far as what they're presenting as what they say to be their morals and ethics and what they actually vote on and what they actually do. That then, to me, the left wing entertaining it as if they're talking to rational people is then just, it's like a weird, it's like a circus. Like they all know that they're part of a circus and they're just playing this game because they're both sides are having fun because it's actually gang warfare, and they're just appeasing their base animal instincts of getting together and yelling. And that's kind of where I do feel like there is something animalistic and mob driven about how our elections and voting have evolved or devolved in the last I don't know if they ever had evolved actually.
I mean, gangs of New York. Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
I was gonna say it just seems like the voting has always been tribal and about the gangs.
I mean, gangs of New York is great. It's a great topic to discuss in this context. I remember from that film you had Tammany Hall, which was extremely corrupt and was supported by illicit gang activity just as much as the opposition's activity. And you had members who were formerly or even currently affiliated with street gang activity and neighborhood protector activity, rising to political positions in opposition to other oppressors. Then they end up becoming oppressors in and of themselves and lead to the destruction of their own neighborhoods. And it's only in those times of great upheaval that the bank accounts, end up getting, or the figureheads for the bank accounts end up getting attacked. I don't think the bank accounts themselves were ever in any danger. I don't think the bank accounts themselves are really ever under threat. It's the people who represent the bank accounts that end up catching flack. But yeah, definitely you had Tammany Hall forcing people back to the voting booths multiple times. I mean, we've even seen current political figures who will currently remain nameless encouraging people to vote multiple times, which is really childish and insane. But have we really come to expect anything different? So yeah, gangs of New York, highly relevant in this context.
Yeah, it's weird that we have one person suggesting illegal behavior to a group of people that then are trying to turn around and say they support law enforcement and that black people should just comply so we don't get murdered. It's the same people. It's the same ones that are about to commit massive voter fraud and be a bunch of fucking felons. That shit is hilarious to me. I hope they do. I really sincerely hope that a bunch of right-wing fucking idiots go out and do this shit, because that would be the most fitting massive wave of like criminal justice that ever happened, that a bunch of right-wing idiots lost their right to vote forever because they broke the law because some dumbass told them to fucking test the system. They're trying to vote twice. Yeah, that obviously, because they're all right wing Republican white people, they're not going to have their rights taken away. But that would be hilarious.
Well, it's just another method to try and disenfranchise the election. It's a gambit and it's a distraction technique. Um, if it also depends on what counties end up getting voted from, because I'm just postulating right now, but if a majority of the fraudulent votes, regardless of what party they voted for, come from an opposition county or an opposition district, then the legal teams representing the losing party will end up trying to push a case through indicating that a majority of the fraud occurred in the opposition's districts. And because votes are supposed to be confidential, they're not necessarily going to be able to immediately request the release of the voters' identities. Maybe that's some Dan Brown shit. Who knows?
Right. I mean, of course, this is like obviously a dumbass approach to trying to test to see if your vote is counted before they're actually counted. Like, they wouldn't have been counted yet. And that's kind of where the fact that they're in the system does not mean that they would have actually been counted yet. And that's kind of where it's a weird, idiotic suggestion that also then begs the question if this dude is either that stupid or is intentionally trying to get these people to lose their rights, which is, my thing is, if he is actually a Russian agent, the logical end would be that the right wing would be undermined and that the America that I would assume left wing people hate would be destroyed. So in that case, I don't understand why left wing people would care if he's actually a Russian asset. Like, because he's not, but that narrative, it's so internally inconsistent from the left that when I'm saying, like, you have this dude who's stoking right-wing racism, making them exposed for the fucking monsters that they are. They've been hidden for fucking 50 years. These racist ass grandpas and grandmas and aunts and uncles that everybody's been trying to act like went away because we fucking voted Obama into office are finally exposing themselves, and we can finally say, get these fucking racists out of our fucking vote. And now we have the opportunity for them to get themselves out of the vote by doing some fucking illegal ass shit. Why is anybody getting in the way? Why is anybody trying to stop them? That to me is insane. Like, oh, these people are about to commit political suicide and never be able to vote again because they're actively going to fucking break the law. Why would you try to stop those people from getting rid of their capacity to vote? Why would anybody try to stop them? Let them do it. Let them do it. I'm not going to encourage them because I'm not a fucking idiot. I'm not a criminal, but I'm going to say, let them do it. I'm not going to get in their way because they're fucking idiots. I don't think they should be voting in the first place. So if they want to actively take themselves out of the capacity to vote, I'm not going to be the one to say, hey, let me try to reason with this idiot and help them get their vote back before they throw it away. Like, why would anybody stop them?
Well, I think it's because people still want the elections to be representative of everybody, even if they disagree with people. I think there's still enough people who think that we have to give everyone a voice. And it's been made very clear to me that there's some people whose ideas should never be taken seriously anymore. And when they inject their ideas when they try to lob that idea into the Overton window, they hit the side of the building. They don't make it into the Overton window.
Yeah.
But it's hard to identify what that is if everyone's not actively participating and paying attention to what is what is capable of passing through the Overton window. I think that just comes with a spectrum of political awareness and a political awakening.
Would there have been as much focus on police brutality and systemic racism had this administration not come into being and there was a blue administration? Do you think there would have been as much of an issue? And do you think the inherent insanity and stupidity of the right wouldn't have been so amplified during a plague had there been a different administration? It's a fair question to ask.
No, because the same shit happened under Obama, and then people act like that shit wasn't happening because they're like, "Oh, give him time, he fix it. He's on the left. He's one of us."
Yeah, that's just framing. That's the tail wagging the dog.
Sure is. Yep.
It's just spin doctors doing their spin doctoring, and it would have been called a different thing. They would have had a different name for the policies. They would have made a different effort to sound a certain way during press conferences. But these things have been going on for a long time. We're at this really unique stage in our ability to transmit information. We can know what's going on in Portland on a granular level, and then we get reporting from people that aren't even in Portland saying that the place is on fire, that it's falling apart, and all this stuff. I know that I have friends in Portland who say it's not on fire. There's like one block that like looks like trash. Well, maybe it's two by now, but and this is kind of the standard right now. We're only being given images that curate a certain type of perception, and that's I'm like a broken record when it comes to things like this. But this is how they manufacture consent. This is how the media and our government shape perspective and shape interpretation. It's how they get everyone to get on board when they decide to enact some kind of law or executive order or send in the troops. Even though a lot of local officials are now stopping requests for outside assistance from outside law enforcement agencies because they want to keep it under control. They don't want it to escalate into a violent clash between citizens and law enforcement. But of course, we're also at this really weird place where citizens are going to protests and rallies wearing body armor and helmets and bringing rifles and handguns, and people are getting shot at rallies now. So it's I think your question is very real. I think that a lot of these things would still be happening. We would just have a different face telling us what the response would be. And for some people, that face is easier to stomach than, crusty Cheeto, or maybe it's not as easy to stomach. Maybe some people like it when he says it versus when Obama says it, and vice versa. Some people would have preferred to hear Obama say it, or Hillary, or whomever. I mean, would it be any different if Bernie was the one telling us that this is what was happening?
Right, because then it's like, would the cops listen to Bernie? These right-wing ass racist cops listen to Bernie.
They're not going to listen to Bernie.
Oh. This is because, again, I think this is where there's an element of when people are like, oh, we're in a civil war. Kind of. It's like, we're not really at a war. We're just trying to...
It's an ideological conflict at this point still.
It's not even conflict. It's like, it's not a conflict because it's been there the entire time. It's a ideological acknowledgement in that the left wing that is acknowledging this right wing is finally acknowledging it for what it is. It was always there. And I don't know if there is actually a conflict because what has appeared to be a conflict between the two sides for the last 60 years has been a charade to keep them in power. So that's where I'm like, I don't even know if what's happening right now can be called a conflict, because I'm not sure if it's going to result in any change in that I'm if you have a conflict and nothing changes, is that actually a conflict, or is that just business as usual? And that's where, again, like we are stuck at a point where, because nothing is changing, these conflicts have become normalized as part of the situation, which is why the riots go back 60 years, the riots go back 100 years, the slave revolts go back 150, 160 years, like, or 160, yeah. So that's where, when you have this element of the racist right wing that has never actually been addressed, I I I struggle to wonder, or struggle to think that we are actually addressing it right now, or if this is just the left wing waking up to it, in the sense of like what I would call actual left wing people, and not the people who are Democrats in name only. Or I don't even know if Democrat should be identified with left wing anymore, just because so much of my life was spent with don't ask, don't tell, no gay marriage Democrats. I don't want to even call them left wing.
I don't think that the Democrats are the people that are actually responsible for this current civil rights protest rally uh, list of activities.
No,
I think it's like a newly emerged left of a group of people that have are going through political awakening, and they're realizing that there has been a long term, um, well, civil rights never stopped. It never ended really, but there are a lot of people who are now aware of it, and they're tired and they had enough, and they finally had enough free time to go protest. And I think that the Democrats are just trying to capitalize on this because it represents an active opposition to the other team.
yeah, I think, yeah, I do feel like more than anything, the Democrats try to capitalize on actual left wing movement more than the movement's actually being led by Democrats. And that distinction is important, in that, you know, what did those kente cloth pictures result in? You know, I don't see any sort of actual institutional or um, policy change from the left or from the Democrats. That photo op was 100% a photo op as of now, because they have not done anything to follow it up. So that's where I'm like, I'm not a fucking idiot. I wasn't born yesterday. This picture did nothing for me. Taking fucking Aunt Jemima off the syrup bottle did nothing for me as far as a black in this country.
That photo op turned into a bunch of vicious memes. I
Right.
think that's all it accomplished. It provided a mechanism to make fun of uh, political politicians' behaviors, and it revealed just how quickly flies jump on shit. Like, I'm not saying that the kente cloth is shit. I'm just saying that, like, there's a shitty situation and they just went right for it. And I think that's the status quo for politics in America, isn't it?
It was very formulaic
Yeah.
at this point. Like, oh, this demographic is experiencing plight that has been consistently occurring, but now, for the benefit of our political dealings and reelection, we should probably make some sort of public show of solidarity. But we really shouldn't like actually do anything about it. But what can we do that's dramatic enough to elicit a response from the public? And what do our friends, and within our organization say is the best thing to do? And what do our publicists think is the best way to do it? And, I think that was the answer at that time.
Yeah, because it's almost like doing nothing would have been better than that at this point. It's like on the day of, maybe they thought, oh, this is a good idea just to show solidarity. But months later, doing nothing would have been better than that fucking stupid ass photo op. It's so insulting now. I mean, it was insulting the day of, but I'm like, okay, you're gonna do this. I'm gonna give you a countdown to follow up. I'm gonna talk about you in a few months because this is some stupid ass shit. Doing this dumbass photo op, knowing damn well you ain't planning to do shit, trying to get my fucking vote. Like, it's the they did less than, or by doing this horrible photo op, they went below doing nothing. Like, they are at a point below where I would have perceived them if they had just done nothing. I am disenfranchised by their actions. Whereas if they had done nothing, they wouldn't have had any actions for me to be disenfranchised by. At least be like, oh, well, they didn't respond, so I guess, like, yeah, business as usual. No, they're just actively trying to make it throw shit in my face. That's what that shit feels like. Like, oh, I'm in Congress. I get paid whatever, $240 an hour. I don't know what the fuck they get paid. Something stupid, something ridiculous because of what the fuck bullshit they are doing. They get paid way too much to then turn around and do some fucking bullshit photo op and not do anything about police murder. Because that's where I'm like, I feel like an idiot then turning around and voicing support for that. Because then I'm just a fucking house Negro at that point. Oh yeah, you get the least. You get a little photo op. You get a little, we put on a kente cloth and then took a knee for you. This was for you. You need to thank us for this. That's the fuck I look like, thanking them for taking a knee for me as a black man in this country who's under constant threat by a fucking system that they fund.
So that's $608 an hour.
Yeah, I was being conservative apparently.
$608. So let's assume that was like a 4-hour photo shoot. That's $2,400 they got paid
to throw that in our faces
and wait around until everyone had their makeup and lighting done, and then posed, and then one image. I'm sure they got paid at least that took at least a couple hours, maybe 3 or 4.
Moment of silence.
I don't even think that they were collectively creative enough to come up with that idea.
Of course not.
What focus group, what PR rep, what assistant, whispered that into somebody's ear? Because clearly, like, how did they even arrive at the conclusion that would be an effective and appropriate response? What do you think about, how they actually arrived at that conclusion? Like, why choose kente cloth? Why kneel with kente cloth? Why did they decide to do it that way?
It was probably some overpaid white male intern that just got out of college, who's like 25 years old, who's like, this is what tests really good with the groups. We did our focus groups, and kente cloths are really popular with the African American and the blacks right now. The blacks are really into kente cloth, so you guys should get some kente cloth and take a knee. Like, that's how I feel like that shit went down, based on what it looks like. There's no way they consulted a black person on that. There's no fucking planet on which they consulted a black person before doing that. Because the black person would be like, well, I like the kente cloth, but why don't you just fucking write an actual bill about police brutality or something? That's what a black person would have immediately said.
I think that the post office meme variation actually made sense. There's a variation of the kneeling kente cloth where, a couple weeks ago everyone was worried about the post office, and that seems to have subsided a little bit. But there was a picture that somebody redid where they changed the kente cloths to post office scarves, and they were kneeling in front of a post office drop box. That actually made sense. But kneeling with African garb in America, nobody knows. Well, some people know what it is, but the vast majority of people don't know what that is. Everyone knows what a post office drop box looks like.
Right.
You know, the whole photo op, I mean, it had to have, in order for that to occur, and in order for the constituents to be appeased, there had to be somebody saying that this is not only acceptable and applicable and resonant with the demographic that we're trying to represent in this, but it also has to be broadly accessible to people who have no personal experience with the struggle that we're trying to address with this picture. So I almost feel like they chose something that just appeared ethnic and seemed to, even to the uneducated eye, say, oh, yes, we're doing something important because it looks like it's something that a black person would wear.
In America?
Yeah, exactly. That's the right response. That's the exact right response. That's the exact.
They could have been wearing fucking Bulls jerseys and it would have made more sense. Or wait, he's from Minneapolis. Vikings jerseys, or not jerseys, football. I guess those are jerseys, shirts, whatever they're called. They could have been wearing an athletics gear, some kind of athletics wear, and it would have made more sense in the American context.
Yeah.
They could have had a Red Lobster shirt and it would have made more sense.
Yeah, that was like a real disconnected act. And that's why, again, I'm looking at these people as if they're then supposed to be like representing me. And I'm supposed to be thankful that they like take a knee. Is that what I'm supposed to be thankful for as a black American? And I'm like be proud of this country for that.
Like, I believe the photo op followed the murder of George Floyd. Was that correct?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
So I could understand perhaps if they were trying to memorialize the death of George Floyd, because there was a photo of George Floyd, wearing kente cloth, and it was something that was important to him personally. And it was a way to be in touch with him and his community and show solidarity by wearing something that was important to him personally. But none of the photos that we see of George Floyd broadly shared in the media or by media outlets that are influenced by either political wing, that are represent the majorities in this country, have any photos whatsoever that I have seen of George Floyd wearing kente cloth.
Yeah, me neither.
He was a big LeBron fan. They could have been wearing Lakers jerseys.
Well, and even further, LeBron is like an active building member of the black community that is constantly taking money and putting it into expanding education and access for black people in the black community. And that's where, like, yeah, that would have been more appropriate and more relevant for black America right now in this moment than kente cloth.
I just did a cursory Google image search for George Floyd wearing kente cloth, and it's all pictures of Nancy Pelosi. And wait, here's Trevor Noah. Nancy Pelosi. African woman obliterates Dems. Okay, now it's not all Congress members. It's actual black people wearing kente cloth. Yeah, most of the images that I'm seeing are of Nancy Pelosi wearing a kente cloth. There's like, I don't even see an image of George Floyd in this search. First, George Floyd wearing kente cloth. Oh, there it is. There's one. It's a picture of him and one of the arresting officers.
But is he wearing kente cloth?
No, he's wearing what he was wearing. No, he's wearing a hoodie. They could have been wearing hoodies, then it would have made more sense at this point.
Yeah, hoodie would have actually made a lot more sense because of Trayvon Martin too.
Yeah. I wonder what the statistics are like. If you're wearing a hoodie, how likely are you to get shot by police, or just get shot? That's
Like,
pretty dark.
yeah, if you're black, I'm sure the numbers go up.
Yeah.
Or Native American for that matter, because I think they might even be shot at a worse rate than black people by police. But nobody ever talks about it.
Well,
Yeah, the indigenous people in the United States and Canada, especially, have an extraordinarily inequitable and difficult time just getting representation in either country.
Yeah, it's real bad.
yeah, they get killed at higher. Native Americans are killed in police encounters at a higher rate than any other racial or ethnic group, according to data from CDC.
Yeah, and that's why again it's like, nobody ever talks about that. Black people don't have the luxury to move on to fight for Native Americans just because we're still under attack. And it's like, yeah, if we could trust that people understood that when we said Native lives matter too, that they didn't forget about Black lives in the process, we'd be saying Native lives matter. But racists are not very good at nuance. But yeah, I think that's where again it's like the people who don't understand Black Lives Matter would then try to. They're the same people who are Bible literalists because then they'll say, "Oh, you don't think other people's lives matter, or this black person died, this random situation. Why aren't you protesting here?" It's like, no, this is specifically about police brutality, and they just try to muddle the waters constantly.
It's a limited attention span. It goes back to how they were educated and raised. I don't know if it has any kind of biological predisposition, but I feel like if there was just a different approach culturally, educationally, there was more compassion that was taught. If the even if the literalism was taught in conjunction with lessons of broad spectrum compassion, and there were significant philosophical lessons about equitable treatment of all people and what the implications of that kind of a society actually mean, and what is required in order to do so. Even if somebody was a literalist, they would still be able to easily come to the conclusion that the statement Black Lives Matter actually carries with it and encompasses.
Yeah, And that's another, I'm trying to get to a point where left wing people understand that they don't need to allow right wing people to define shit for us. Like, right wing people should not be allowed to define left wing shit. If some right wing person starts talking about, but doesn't Black Lives? Nope, cut them off. Nope, you are not an advocate for Black Lives Matter, so you don't get to express what Black Lives Matter means or thinks because you don't understand it and you're going to misrepresent it. Nope, don't let those people even. I don't even let them fucking get their shit out anymore because it's like that type of red herring, fucking misrepresentation of intention is how the actual meaning gets subverted over time, where they constantly try to redefine it and say, oh, this is what they're thinking. This is the Black Lives Matter people are terrorists that think all white people this and that. And like they then start to define it as if they are the progenitors of the movement. And that's kind of like, again, that's the colonialist way. They try to subvert and then take over. That's kind of what, again, when we're talking about information warfare and talking about books of the Bible being left out and all that, this is all relevant to these same people. It's not an accident that the construction of their spiritual belief system is meant to give them license to disregard facts that do not make them feel good. And that's kind of where that basic premise of giving this group specifically freedom to, especially in the context of a book that promotes slavery, giving these people the license to disregard outside influences, it just reinforces the racist slave owner construct that unfortunately we have not actually gotten rid of in America. Like the Civil War didn't get rid of that construct or that mindset.
So absolutely, the Civil War did not get rid of it. Reconstruction did not get rid of it. The Civil Rights Movement broached the subject. A lot of people on the left, on the right, even in the middle, they think that, or they're taught that, and then subsequently think that, or even people who were part of it, think that because it happened, that was a resolution of some kind. And in my understanding, there was no resolution because we're still dealing with the same issues today. And they've become even more exacerbated and pronounced over time. And the civil rights movement was important in the sense that it started the conversation, and leaders representing their respective demographics for the first time in generations were able to sit down with each other in public forums and just talk about the inequity and the inequitable nature of the societies that they were both existing in, regardless of whether or not somebody was able to convince somebody of something else. It started the conversation, and it basically emphasized the dichotomy, and it brought it to the forefront of people's minds as something that existed. But where people arrive in error is that they see it as it's something that happened and something that resolved a problem. And therefore, because their political leaders were aligned with members of the civil rights movement at some point in time, that means that the issue has been resolved because their favorite political leader and representative is still in office. So they're not just fighting the good fight, but they've managed to solve a lot of problems. And I think we're seeing quite clearly that these problems have not been solved.
Yeah, because then on the one hand, obviously the problems haven't been solved, but then these people are presenting themselves as if they're going to solve the problem. And it's this weird impasse where obviously these same people can't solve the problems if they didn't solve them before. And that's where I'm in a mindset of fool me once, and that's kind of where obviously you can't completely pull yourself away from uh, the political landscape and expect it to just work itself out. But at the same time, engaging in it in this current iteration doesn't get anywhere. So it's this, like I said, it's an impasse where it almost feels like we're gonna have, you know, something happen like an actual nationwide earthquake or some shit that just destroys so much infrastructure that we can't even act as if we can have the luxury to discuss anything but the infrastructure. We don't have the capacity or freedom, but we're still convinced that we do. It's so weird to see people think they have the time to think about other people's lives, like celebrities and shit. That Americans think that they have the luxury time to wonder what Britney Spears or whoever is fucking, like, whatever they're doing right now in their lives. Like, we don't have the luxury time to think about that shit because we have to worry about making sure we don't die ourselves. But the fact that people think that they have that kind of luxury time to then just turn around and peer into somebody else's life, it's like I don't even know how to describe how weird that is, because then those same people will act as if they don't have time to better themselves or do something like learn a fucking language or some shit like that. Learn a second language, because most Americans don't even know a second language, let alone a third or fourth. So, or get more acquainted with their own language. Like, there's a whole bunch of low frequency words in English that most people don't know, that people would then be smarter and more worldly for learning. But no, they feel as if they have the luxury time to go peer into somebody else's life. Because
Grandiose, lexicon, and plethora. Those are the words that came to mind when you said low frequency words.
I feel like those are high frequency words for our group.
Well, yeah, but I'm just trying to project into what low frequency words actually means.
Cornucopia.
Nobody says cornucopia, Daniel. Nobody.
Yeah, cornucopia is definitely a low frequency word.
Isn't a cornucopia associated with like Thanksgiving or something? Like you put
Yeah,
put a bunch of stuff in a cornucopia.
You fill it with
that's where
squash and tomatoes that you aren't going to eat.
right? So you have like a cornucopia of squashes, cornucopia
grapes. They always include grapes in it.
of grape, right? And then you see cornucopias in like in like 16th and 17th century European paintings.
Well, at one point, the pineapple
Still
was
life.
a sign of opulence and wealth, and people would rent pineapples and carry them around. It would cost something on the order of like $8,000 when adjusted for inflation to have a pineapple. But I'm serious. Look up the history of the fucking pineapple. People would like, drop huge amounts of cash so they could walk around a party with a pineapple that they were never going to eat.
It's like it reminds me of like what is the modern equivalent of that? And I think of like the Met Gala, where people are wearing like $20,000 clothing or articles of clothing that they're never going to wear again, or that are supposed to, that they're basically, wearing to advertise for a particular designer or line. And it's like, who's the artisanal pineapple purveyor of this time, walking down the red carpet with a fucking pineapple. Like, if time travel exists, I want to see that shit, just so I can say I saw it, just so I can be amused at how proud this person is of their pineapple.
Also wondering if it was like a easier way to cover up smells or something.
Apparently, people carried them around until they were rotting.
Oh well, never mind.
Yeah, I mean, if you had a pineapple, man, you were living life.
It's like just like a flex move as you walk into a tavern, you like put your fucking half rotten pineapple on the table.
Yeah.
And everybody's like, "Oh,
Got a big spender here, guys. He's got a rotten pineapple." That's the
Drinks
thing.
on that guy.
Yeah. Can you imagine the kind of pressure you would have to be under to think, "Oh man, I gotta go get a new pineapple"?
Like, I paid $8,000 for this thing. I better carry it until it's rotten. I better get as much runway out of this thing as possible.
So at the time, that was the same amount of money that was required to buy a new coach. Meaning you already had horses to pull your coach around.
I bet there was just this one dude, this one noble, who would like buy a new coach and then like buy 4 pineapples to put on each of the posts and like ride up to a party. Everybody's like, "Oh, it's that dude."
The Steve
That
Aoki
count.
of that
It's that
era would have been
Baron.
throwing pineapple wedges at people. That's what music festivals would have been like in the pineapple era. Throwing little chunks of pineapple into the crowd, watching them go crazy.
Like frisbee discs. It just like lands on someone's forehead and they freak out.
Oh yeah.
Exceptional Radio.
Exceptional Randos Show is produced live in Sunroom Studios' Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.
Well, that was random. Exceptional Radio.